After e4, d6, white takes advantage to put 2 pawns in the center. And of course, black cannot play a move like e5 because of the swap, and then black loses the right to castle. And that's just not a thing in the Pirc. So in the Pirc defense, there's plenty of variations. This is just the first video, but there's going to be more. The ideas will be g6 or maybe knight f6, eventually knight to d7 with pawn in e5 blocking off the center, and the bishop in fianchetto, especially because there's a pawn in d6. Let's go through some general ideas when they play knight f6 immediately. So knight c3 comes now, and then g6. I mean, the moves most of the time, so we're just going to transpose. White now immediately plays bishop g5. And two main options we're going to look at, but then I'm going to go deeper in the Pirc in the next video. There's going to be bishop g7 immediately, or knight to d7 to safeguard the pawn structure of the black player. So after bishop to g7, white continues with queen to d2. The ideas against the Pirc will be this: queen and bishop on this dark square bishop on the same diagonal, long castle, the queen and the rook will be attacking the open file as soon as this pawn is removed, the d pawn. So after castling, white will castle alongside as mentioned. And by the way, if instead of castling black had played h6, white will just play bishop f4 and then carry on with the same plan. There's nothing to worry about a move like knight to h5 because the bishop can just come back, and then that will make black waste too many tempos, and it will allow white to play moves like f4, f3, g4, which are part of the plan anyway, and the black player will be castling short side, so it's good that we're already pushing the pawns. Anyway, after black castles and white castle alongside, let's pay attention to the fact that black cannot play the thematic move e5 in this situation, simply because we can take and then the knight will be pinned, and this queen is only defended once, and we have a strong control of the file. And the thematic knight to d7, which is the very move that every Pirc player knows, that has to play before e5 so that it can take back. In this case, it's just too late, because after knight d7, white could push immediately, and after take, we're gonna have too much attack on d8. So black will not be able to take, but he will have to play like knight to e8, for instance, after which white will continue with h4. Look at the black pieces and how they are all blocked off by the pawns. This is ridiculous. White's got much more freedom and nothing stops him from playing h5 and then push also the other pawns, play the bishop in c4. Maybe it depends on what black does, and the rooks will be well placed very soon as this h pawn is gone. It looks like black can take the pawn now because he's got 3 attackers, but that's not a problem, in case you're wondering that. After take, well, the knight cannot take back because they lose the queen, but after bishop takes, maybe with an idea of playing something like bishop to d6, knight f6 later, and lots of other things, looks like the game is about to become normal. Maybe even knight f6 or bishop back, whatever. White now goes on with h5, which justifies the reason why we play h4, like, because we're just going up. Position is evaluated as +4 for white, and you can tell why. Black is not able to develop this bishop, light square bishop, anytime soon, because that will have to move the knight, and then that loses the queen. A move like knight f6. Oh, by the way, let's not go through pawn takes h5, because it's pointless to go through such a thing. After a move like knight f6, for example, then finally we take the pawn, making sure this rook becomes strong, and after pawn takes back, opening the file for the rook, allowing the queen some ideas of defense potentially. Oh, and by the way, let's quickly mention that if black had taken with the other pawn, I mean, this closes up the king, and the access to the king side of every other black piece will be completely denied. So white will play knight f3, attacking the knight. Remember, we have 2 pieces attacking the 8, so the bishop can't move. And after the bishop goes back, white will simply take the knight, and the knight f6 is not enough to stop queen h6. So take, and then queen h6, right? We're going for checkmate, and knight h5 is met by the very, very important g3, which stops bishop f4, winning for black. The idea now is knight to g5, winning the game next move, and this is unstoppable. Unless black wants to give up the queen by playing maybe e6, but even, for example, f6 seems to be stopping knight g5. That, the pawn is taken, and there's the arrival of the other pieces. So back in this position, we were looking at f takes g6. White develops with tempo with bishop c4 check, king moves, and now knight f3 developing with tempo as well. Bishop moves, he can't be protected by a pawn really. And now white simply plays bishop h6 and the rook's got nowhere to go because of the other bishop as well. If black gets, white's gonna go up the exchange. If black goes rook e8 is a last attempt of saving the rook. This is not even met by bishop f7, which still traps the rook, but knight g5 is now more deadly. Games evaluated plus 10 for white, so we can close this line for the moment. It's time for a recap. So d4, and we look at the early knight f6. So knight g3, then g6, bishop g5. We are looking at bishop g7 variations. So queen d2, immediately placing these two on the same diagonal, and then castle, castle. So what happens after we went through all the mess, e5, knight d7. So whenever these patterns will occur against the Pirc, if you watch this video a few times until you memorize these patterns, then anytime you encounter them, you can take the advantage straight away. Let's look at this other very popular move, knight c6. It looks normal, and at least it doesn't close the queen up forever, because as we mentioned, knight d7 here is a mistake. It's just too late for black to play such move. Should have played it before. We're gonna look at it in a few minutes. Knight c6. White now plays, guess what? h4. Obviously, that's what we're going for. What happens and this is a pattern to know, okay, we're going to go first through e5, but also h5 right away. This seems the most logical reply, and by the way, it's the best move for black. However, let's mention e5 now. What's the difference between e5 before and now? Earlier we had a knight in d7, which cut off the strength of the black queen. So e5 now, still we take, and now f4, and we should be able to play e5. So this knight has to move. Let's say knight to g4, for instance. An idea like bishop developing here is white just goes up material. There's pawn, 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 and there's going to be just black just loses material a lot. So after knight goes to g4, for instance, either way, we're playing e5. This pawn can't take because we have two pieces on the open file going to d8. The best move according to the engine, the one that allows black to fight back a bit more, is h6. Here, careful, white will have to take the bishop with the knight. Bishop takes and pawn takes, and white's up a piece. So in this position, we just saw e5. Let's look at h5, best move and the most annoying one because it's kind of very solid. So white plays the obvious f3. The future of the light square bishop against the Pirc is often this way, like bishop c4, sometimes d3, sometimes e2, it depends. We never really give it for the knight here. It doesn't make any sense because we're achieving nothing after that swap, and we never fianchetto it this side because these pawns are going to be going up, pushing, so the bishop will want to go here and attack the king like this, whilst the rooks come on these files, right? So that makes sense. So now also let's try to remember the importance of this move, and I think that out of all the things you are hopefully learning from this video against the Pirc and all the patterns, the most instructive one, the most interesting one is that this kind of move really kills the light square bishop. Like this has got nowhere to go. Fianchettoing it will make this bishop still like unable to really be useful because there's going to be just too many pawns on the light square and it'll just be stuck there. And also now the bishop has only got this square to go. e6 met by a fork, f5, g4, h3, they're all inaccessible clearly because the pawn, and d7 will block the queen. And so this move here is just amazing. So let's go on with the plan now. What can black do? One move that I encounter a lot is knight to h7. Before we go there, let's mention for a second e5. In this case, well, okay, e5 here is met by g4. So needless to say, one thing I need to add actually is that f3, the idea of clearly g4. Now this is not a pawn, this is not a free pawn. So if black plays a e5 or potentially most other moves, you will go on with this plan. The only time this doesn't happen, at least as far as I know, is when they play knight h7 with an attack on the bishop, and this bishop is too important for us because it's stuck in so many squares. We're going to go to e3, we're going to go there in a second. But if they play, let's say, e5, g4. This is not a free pawn because after pawn takes, we don't take back, allowing the bishop to come to g4 and attack our rook with tempo, and that's just good for black. Black could even play defensive, something like bishop h5 later. White now goes on with h5. So the idea of f3 g4, remember, is to break up the black king side. Okay, the knight cannot take because of the pin, and now nothing stops the white's infiltration. Here the position is evaluated as plus 350, something like that. So let's go back just a second, because we are going to analyze such a type of position anyway. Let's go on with this line. When they play knight h7 attacking the bishop goes to e3. Position is very comfortable for white. So knight h7 not only attacked the bishop, but it gave black the idea of playing f5 in order to kind of dismantle the huge advantage that white has on the light squares. f5 idea of developing the bishop, opening up the rook, and now it looks like e5 could be an idea now, but it's still not very strong because white will play d5 attacking the knight, and this knight is going to be harassed and will be in a bad position. Knight d4 is black loses control of the center forever, because now white cannot take like this because the pawn, but he can just play knight g2 e2 and he will just be able to develop the bishop. Next move, if black knight takes in e2, white will take back with the bishop, and that will reinforce the attack on the light squares, and nothing stops us from slowly build a good attacking plan on the king side. An idea here, for example, I've encountered a lot, is c6, which allows the queen the way out, but it doesn't work because you just go for the pawn. And if black plays c5 instead of c6, take en passant, and knight takes back, this is a backward pawn in d6, so white's winning, or at least it's just much more comfortable. And if black takes back with the pawn, again, it's just go for this extra pawn. There's really no compensation. It's not like the game is completely over, but it's evaluated +3 because it's not just a pawn up, but rather just like much better position and development. So back in this position, let's have a look at the move. Instead of e5 that we just saw, let's have a look at f5. We actually do take. Looks weird because we are getting rid of one of the pawns, or one of the light pawns that was controlling so many squares. But after bishop takes back, white now continues with bishop h6. Of course, if we have to swap the dark square bishop, is going to have to be with the other dark square bishop, not with the knight in h7. So that's why we moved it back to e3 and now back to h6. The best move now, according to the engine, is e6. Of course, bishop takes, queen takes here is completely pointless. So let's just see it for the sake of argument. Here, white has the idea of g4. So if black plays, let's say, any move like e6, for instance, to allow the queen some degrees of attack, or even especially queen e7 to g7 potentially, whatever, any move, g4 comes. And the bishop's trapped, so after takes. And in this specific scenario, we don't really play h5, we can just take, and the bishop again is trapped as mentioned. Bishop takes, and then we have this. So that was the threat. And yeah, so back in this position, as we say, we have to take in f5, bishop takes, bishop h6, and as mentioned, best move by the engine is e6. White continues now with knight to e2, idea of going to g3. Black continues with queen to a7, only move to kind of get the pieces to play, also because black wants to activate the other rook. Either way, even after queen f6, in order to put more pressure on d4, whenever that happens and your d4 pawn is under too much pressure, you can swap the bishop. So after queen e7, for example, you can already do it, for even though, like, queen f6 would have been met kind of similarly. So after bishop takes, queen takes, the idea is that now we play knight g3 as mentioned, and we should take that bishop. Let's look lastly at two ideas now. Knight f6 to get the knight back in the game. We simply take the bishop. And g takes is really bad because it opens up the queen, the king on this file. Let's look at it very quickly. If g takes, then we can play bishop c4, attacking the pawn in e6, and after d5, attacking the bishop, we can go to b5, and this is a bishop we're willing to swap, even though it's on the same color as so many other pawns. The point is that this is a winning endgame, so we trade into a winning endgame, keeping control of the square e5 forever, which means that the e6 pawn is backwards, typical liability like in the games against the Caro-Kann, or sometimes even against the Pirc. And besides, the idea was to create danger from bishop c4 to the pawn in e6 and eventually swap it, causing black to take back, so that we immediately remove this bishop, the light square bishop, with the tempo. And now white simply goes on with knight e2, position is evaluated plus 350. Nothing stops, so many different idea afterwards. Like now knight f4 is coming, and white's position is so much better. So back in this position, after knight f6, we said we're going to take the bishop in f5, pawn takes back the other pawn, the e pawn. Simply bishop c4 now comes with a check, king moves, knight e2, same stuff. The g5 move will never be possible for black, because that will open up the file for the rook, and nothing stops white from playing knight f4. One more thing that can be mentioned from such a line is that black doesn't have to play immediately at knight f6, but can play this very logical idea, rook f6 with rook f8. After all, the reason for one of the reasons for f5 was not only the development of the light square bishop, but also the opening up of the f5 for the rook. After rook moves, then we can take, and again, it's kind of similar. So after rook takes, in order to keep control of the file, white can play g4. The idea is opening up the file so that later there will be an attack on the queen and king. After pawn takes and rook to f7 or rook to f6, but either way, even after rook f7, best move is g5. Black now can develop the last rook, but this knight is being stuck, and now it cannot really move anymore. So the idea of opening up the file for the rook, sacrifice this knight, unless black want to keep the rook in a8, but then play knight f, I don't know, something like that, and then e5. It's just gonna take too long. White now continues with d5, attacking the knight and winning the pawn in e6 with a deadly attack. Taking it doesn't work because queen d5, pinning the rook, and this will be met by bishop c4 and then a bunch of pinning and then pressuring f7. And last thing I'm going to mention about this line is that the desperate attempt of the queen of swapping queens is also met very calmly by bishop c4. Taking allows the pin and white wins the endgame. Not taking will allow either way white to have the possibility to just swap maybe in case he will want to. It's not necessary. That will allow the bishop to win the game.